also run his own consultancy. He's currently the Senior Risk Engineer at Generali and is also their Global Technical Coordinator for Engineering. Trevor Cheney is a Chartered Engineer as a member of both the Institution of Civil Engineers and Structural Engineers here in the UK. He has a degree in Civil and Structural Engineering and has worked predominantly for both large multinational and small engineering consultancies, working on design and construction of infrastructure, airport terminals, including flood risk assessments. He's worked mainly in the UK and the Middle East, and for the last 5 years of his career, he was the UK construction practice lead at RSA. He retired from RSA in March 2023, but continued sitting on the CIREG working group for the CIREG Guide to Managing Flood Risk during construction until this document was completed in December 2023. As Stephanie said, please put questions in the chat as you go. I will try and moderate those and interject to James and Trevor as appropriate. So, James, Trevor, thank you very much for joining us today. Grateful for your time and expertise. Please, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Patrick. Stephanie, could you just pop the slides on the screen? I'm seeing lots of names of people. Thank you. Just waiting for it to come up. Perfect. So as you can see, this is the talk on the CIREG guide. The subtitle is Managing Rainfall, Inundation and Flood Risk on Buildings, Civil Engineering and Infrastructure Projects during the Development, Design and Construction phases. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So just to give a bit of background, I'm not going to read through these elements of the slides. We're just going to try and discuss them as they go through, but there are some elements in there. CIREG were approached by LEG and others to formally put a guide together, and it took a couple of years to write. It does cover technical aspects. It doesn't cover underwriting. Deductibles, exclusions, sublimits, clauses. We've anonymized it as much as possible, and the word flood is a catch-all term, and we try to go through those elements as best we can. We would strongly request that you review the document and send it out. It's no good being left on a shelf. It needs to go through the clients and through the brokers and through underwriters to get it widely used. Because what we're looking to do is to get a sort of a broad approach. And if the more people that use the guide, the more people we can get consistency. So if you can pop through onto the next slide. I'm seeing a bit of what's it, slide 3, please. Within the guide, we highlight a number of case studies. I think there's 23 or 24 in total, which just give a bit of an overview. So we'd be going, the deep excavation, main flood risks, various elements where we've identified or seen losses in the past. And what we're trying to do is to create a context for the document. I'll give you a moment to read that page. We're also trying to pick up the impact of such events, not just the physical side, but the but the sort of the time impact that relates to any reinstatement works. If we could move on again to the next page.
James, so I just if you don't mind, just step in there and just clarify the scope of the document. Because you say not including escape of water, that's covered elsewhere in another CIREG document. But that first example there, that water escaping from a water main, I mean, kind of there's a potential for confusion there that could be viewed as escape of water, but that's an external water main bursting and bringing water onto the site, and that is within your scope, right?
Yes, we're looking to basically external sources of water that are that are going to penetrate a building envelope or affect a project.
Yeah.
Escape of water. There's recently been a FBA Risk Authority update on escape of water joint code of practice, which we, as CIREG, we were part of the drafting of that, and we would strongly recommend that people look at that as the next step forward in the escape of water management side of projects, i.e. damage within buildings caused by that. Yeah, we are looking at external forces. As we said originally, rainfall, inundation, and external flood risk. Yeah, so that's a good clarification. I appreciate that. The next one, please. Just pop onto the next screen. We do obviously highlight examples of damage within buildings. It's obviously section 5. And again, these were just said samples, examples of different sorts of water-related damage, which are extensive. Again, we will point you back to the guide for these ones, but we just wanted to show what's within the guide driving our consideration. If we move on to the next phase, please. Next slide, sorry.
James, just to let you know, I'm clicking through really quick, but Microsoft is pushing it really slow, so there is a slight delay, probably via the web.
I like the blending of the document of the pages. It looks very professional. So the guide. Well, what's in it? Obviously, what we've tried to do is split the document up into various sections. We've tried to set the scene, identify the sources of water. So what we're trying to do is to offer people a pathway to understanding, to what's there, to what the terminology involved, how they can greater understand the sources of water and the impacts that they may have. We then obviously promote a sort of construction stage flood risk assessments, and then again looking at how the exposure to each proportion of the project is, and mitigation activities that can be undertaken prior to and during the construction phase. And then we've got sort of responses that in the event of a storm event or other sort of inundation event coming, what you can possibly do to sort of mitigate for that damage in a short time frame. I will also point you to the appendices. We'll talk about them. I talk about all these sections in the conversation. The appendices are an extremely useful part of the document. It introduces flood. It sort of identifies elements within the document itself, because we wanted to try and keep it as brief as we could, along with some special sort of risks, such as culvert screens and things like that. But that's in essence how it's set out. So if we can move on to the next phase, slide, sorry. So section 1 is obviously the introduction and scope. As I said on the bottom, it promotes the hazard awareness, and we try to give some flavour of what we're trying to do. Really, it's just a one-page summary of where we're going to be. Move on to section 2, please. Next slide. Again, we're trying to now drill down into those areas where there is exposure to the project, which are going to require consideration. And again, these are areas that we've found in the past that are create the vulnerabilities. Again, I'll give you a moment just to read through that. We're trying to keep the slides short, so to get you to look at the document itself. Again, we've discussed these areas in detail to come up with a document that's going to work. Again, moving on, please. Again, what we're just trying to do in this is just to identify some points to be considered within the project itself. Things that maybe don't immediately come to mind, as well as we got the inherent risks, as well as the indirect consequences of flooding. And I think we're seeing more impacts of the sort of the indirect consequences, especially on sort of business disruption elements. So we are trying to pick up those elements again, just to be considered as that. We'll flip through because I think there's more meatier sections throughout the document. So yeah. And then we on the section 3 we come on to the again the common causes sources of water and their impacts. Again, what we're trying to do is to explain, again focusing on those external sources that can cause issues, and all we're trying to do is just highlight those particular, both the sources and this section, the next page is vulnerabilities. So if we move on, I'm speeding through these elements because we have the meat of the document is later on. Again, looking at sort of the locations and the topography of the site and the topographic changes of the site. Obviously, as we are infrastructure projects and large developments do cause changes to both the topographic changes and the sort of the runoff and other sort of catchment issues with water. As we said, changes of use, the impact of agricultural areas, the sediment and blocking of culverts and drainage systems and things like that. That can block pipelines and things like that. Again, the impact of third-party works and activities. We're seeing impacts from upstream events causing unanticipated consequences to projects downstream. And again, these are items that we are looking at. The bottom one on that particular section again was in a few summers ago in London, in the UK. We had a lot of storm bombs. I think it was June 21 or something like that, where we had a number of large summer storm events, creating sort of 70 mil of rain in a very short period, which the surface water flooding managed to make their way into basements and open excavations, and the impact on buildings under construction. Certainly from my perspective, I see a large number of basement areas that are used for plant rooms, and the vulnerability of electrical systems and mechanical systems to storm water is growing as a concern. So that's really, again, section 3, just again continuing to create the background to the document. If you can move on to section 4, please.
Want me to take over now then, James?
Yeah, if you can. Thanks, Trevor.
Yeah.
So,
section 4 is about project flood risk assessment. The usual procedure at planning stage or where the project sponsor will have a flood risk assessment done purely for the completed project. But we very rarely see construction phase risk assessments for flooding. So this is obviously where it's very important in that the project flood risk assessment process should typically include as a minimum all permanent and temporary works, because that's where, say, things are vulnerable, especially if it's including sort of diversion of large pipe works, culverts, channels, etc., where there can be considerable damage if any temporary works are not designed properly. Excavation or protection of sensitive equipment. A bit further on in the document, we talk about the storage of materials. That's got quite a meaty section on that. Elevation and protection of sensitive equipment when it's being stored, appropriate sequencing of the permanent works during the construction phase, and provision of storage and construction materials and equipment. This is something we have seen on some projects in Wales, whereby, when I was a young site engineer, we always used to put a berm at the top of excavations and a channel to take water away. This wasn't done on a project, and unfortunately all the water ran down and all the slopes collapsed, etc. The remedial action to sort it all out was to put a berm at the top with a channel taking the water away. Now, often that is included in the permanent works, but sometimes during construction it's done out of sequence. So it's things like that that you really have to be careful of, because a little bit of water can cause an awful lot of damage. And most of this sort of flood risk project, construction phase flood risk assessment is really involved in how you're going to alter the topography as the works goes on, and making making sure that the contractor takes all the precautions that are necessary. Now, again, the flood risk assessment for the permanent works will probably be 50 years for commercial and probably 120 or 150 for sort of public works like bridges and roads, etc. So we're probably only interested as construction insurers in perhaps the first 4-5 years of it. So consequently, some of the things may not that are actually in the permanent works flood risk assessment are way too far in the future. But it's that you've got to look at the flood risks over that construction phase, and unfortunately, that is not seen to be done in the planning or sort of project. Sort of when you're starting the project, that's just not considered at all. So it is very much a contractors led phase. So flood risk hazard maps should be incorporated in the flood risk assessment for the different scenarios throughout the construction period. So both the document that the underwriters, construction underwriters should be looking at should be quantitative and incorporating hydrological assessments, probabilistic methods and analysis in flood modelling with probabilities of exceeding baseline and design assumptions. Implement real-time or almost real-time mechanisms for weather and storm prediction, and consider historical flood data. Consider all sources of water and uncertainties in key modelling parameters due to climate change. Flash floods should be considered potential vulnerabilities. Rapidity, impact from both water and materials, and the requirement for emergency actions. Incorporate the results of flood risk assessment during construction to be monitored, reviewed and updated regularly as necessary. A couple of instances we were doing development within a protected flood zone, and the insurers and the planning authority were very concerned about if there was a breach in those protections. They wanted to know what would be the speed of the water flowing into site and how far it would come, etc., so that they could all be evacuated safely. So this cost the project sponsor quite a considerable amount of money, because there was no Environment Agency, this was a UK job, there was no modelling from them. So a separate hydrological consultancy had to be appointed to be able to do that sort of work. So that's sort of the level that is required for major infrastructure. And it sort of must follow the normal procedures of considering the source, the pathway, and the receptor for internal and external interfaces and third parties. Section 4 sort of continued. So that's what we're looking for, or that's what we should all be looking for within the documents. And sort of this is laid out in Appendix 1, the Flood Risk Management Plan. Sorry, could we have the next slide? Again, there's just some more notes about the procedure. Thankfully, say in the UK, and I believe mainly in Europe as well, the process is project sponsor, planning, etc. And that, but some of the information I've seen from the from Africa, for instance, it's fine if it's, say, a European contractor involved, but if it's a local contractor, you just don't seem to get this information, and you have to ask for it all the time. All right, next slide, please.
Trevor, there's been a question come in which is probably relevant to take at this stage,
Yep.
and it sort of chimes with something that I've been thinking about as well, and that so I'll read out the question and maybe I'll follow up with a follow-up after that. The question is, would you see early contractor involvement as a tool to improve flood safety in regards of construction risk, and maybe broaden that out to to the extent to which form of contract has an influence on the ability to tackle these sorts of issues during the construction process?
Well, yes, yeah, I would see that to be very important, especially if there's got to be a lot of sort of redirection of rivers. I've only ever been involved really with one early contractor involvement, and that was for a bridge over a very busy motorway. So the amount of sort of water diversion wasn't actually important there, but obviously keeping excavations flowing free from water, etc., so that there wasn't any damage caused to the existing road. So on that one, yes, there was the UK's early contractor involvement. Contract let, the contractor got it, and then they began sort of doing the design work or the construction program with the original designers. So yeah, if with the UK contracting system is obviously slightly different from the European, because it tends to be the contractor does the design as well. But in the UK, it's often done by one consultancy and then the contractor. So there has to be, all disciplines have got to really join together to ensure that they prepare a construction phase flood risk assessment and then stick to it and then say monitor it.
So that's sort of heading in the direction of my follow-up question. Really was around, you make the really good point, and we've seen it ourselves, that when you ask for a flood risk assessment, you'll be sent something for the permanent works, and that's great for the property market, but less so for us. So it is that construction stage risk assessment that we're often looking for and less likely to see. But generally, in your experience, and maybe James, you can chime in as well, how aware do you think the industry is to the flood risk during construction, and And what's the sort of trend, the direction of travel here? Is it getting better? Not to ask a loaded question, sorry.
I found that it varies considerably. Say the contractor that was in the doing the Welsh project just clearly didn't consider the Welsh Roads contract, where we had a lot of soil stabilisation and all that collapse. That there was nothing wrong with the sequencing; they just didn't carry out the protections. And it was obviously something that, from me when I was a young site engineer to when the works were being done, sort of in 2015 time, there was a standard detail that had been used had sort of got lost, and it was disappointing. And yet on a number of other projects I've seen where they're doing, say, pumping stations next to rivers, where they're drawing water out of the rivers and putting them into, say, a service reservoir to then go on to purification at a later date. That was incredibly well thought out. There was we didn't actually, I couldn't ever find a phased plan, a construction phase flood risk assessment, but someone had clearly thought about it, because that required a narrowing of a river channel, and there was temporary works done up there. There was bypass channels done, etc. So a lot of effort and a lot of sort of temporary works had been put into that, and all that was really was just renewing some screens and putting in some new pumps and some new thrust blocks. It wasn't even a large project, but the temporary works probably cost far more than the permanent works did. So one would like to think that it would be getting better, and hopefully with this documentation it will get better.
You'll just step in there a bit. Again, a bit later in the document, you'll see there's a sort of a schedule of deliverables, where what we're trying to do is to get people that consider the flood risk at the appropriate stages throughout the life of the project. Will come on to it later, but certainly early contractor engagement is a key, and it should be, if it costs money, it needs to be included. And if they're not going to do, if you're not including additional costs for temporary works, then it's not going to happen in this environment. Again, comment on what Trevor said. Yeah, we see limited sort of formalised temporary works flood protection documents. And these are, so the opportunity to miss out areas or loss of key staff who have that knowledge. If they go to a different site, then the knowledge is in their head is lost on the project. So, trying to get good risk management procedures and documentation in place that can, continue life throughout the life of the project. That's what we're looking for, and as risk engineers, that's questions that we would be asking whilst we're on site. So yeah.
Right. Okay, section 5, again, won't bother reading it all out, but yeah, consideration must be taken for all of those items listed there well before work is started on site. This section determines key stages and associated activities related to each stage of a typical project, including the use of risk registers, are introduced to enable clear communication of identified risks to the supply chain and clear allocation of those risks by contract parties within the project. Introduce the concept and ensure responsible person for flood is in place and a clear line of accountability in respect of flood. I've been to sites where you point out those items and they say, oh, well, so the site manager deals with that. And you think, well, no, he's probably got far too much work on his hands. This needs to be someone else who's out there making sure that pumps are working, all that the temporary works are in place, and it's going in accordance with the risk registers. Because you only need the pumps to run out of if you're doing an over pumping scheme where You've got the pumps there, and they only just need to run out of fuel, and that's it. You know, you can have a very large claim for actually what would have just cost very little to keep going. Next slide, please.
Right. And Trevor, if you don't mind me just jumping in there, I go back to the point I made in the introduction about as much loss activity comes from weather and water as fire and explosion. Yeah, we'll expect, excuse me, we'll expect there to be some sort of fire marshal or fire warden or some sort of fire protection dedicated resource, but we never expect that for water. And perhaps there ought to be one. Perhaps there ought to be a water marshal or a water warden.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, talking about that, we introduced the responsible person. Obviously, that came from the sort of CIREG document. It's trying to create, as I said, lines of responsibilities with an overview. They don't have to be the project manager. They just have to be somebody that has the skills and knowledge sets to enable them to ensure that the work is overseen in the way that it should be done. And I think it's starting to pay dividends in the escape of water field, because there's named people in place. Again, resilience and mitigation. I was at a project the other day, and with sort of multiple temporary pumps and generators. Unfortunately, they're all very close to each other. So, I mean, there is a potential for these things to catch fire. And if you lose one pump, you're going to lose all of them. So you have to consider the impact of the loss of the entire pumping scheme if you've got insufficient separation between the elements. It's just, you know, almost looking back to sort of the property world and seeing what you need to be able to manage these systems in a reasonable way. Yeah.
Yeah, so Section 6 deals with resilience and mitigation from flood water. It may be necessary to actually build some temporary works, and that to protect a site from flooding. The usual ones are ground profiling, provision of adequate flood walls or berms, provision of equipment such as dewatering equipment. Not all measures may be appropriate to all projects. The project team will be best placed to assess their project and manage the works accordingly. On what a river diversion scheme that I was involved with, they just use the ballast sacks that you see on sort of lorries taking materials to site, filled those up with excavated material, put them down. So they actually built a temporary dam for the weeks that the work was, or for the months that the work was required. A very inexpensive system. They lined it all with a waterproof liner, and then put pumps in the area where they were doing the excavations for an extension to a pumping station. Very well thought out, yeah, that project went very well. Very important river that it was next to. You know, they could have gone and used other river projects I've done in the past. They've used sheet piling to do a temporary cofferdam. So there's numerous ways in which it can be done. An African project was they totally built or excavated a new river channel beside the existing one, made it large enough to take the flows, and then they built the dam within that excavations. So it's a matter of horses for courses, and making sure that all the protections are done and will work. Right.
I was going to say, certainly we see that on tunnelling projects as well, where you need to be, protecting the shaft by, locally increasing the ground level and putting extending the shaft up a metre or two above ground level. Just adding physical protection, thinking about the exposures and being able to react accordingly.
Well, that might be a time just the comment's been made in the chat rather than a question, but maybe that kind of can bring that comment in here, in that in my experience of these sorts of issues, that sometimes when you get to site, so the comment is, I'll read it out. It's vital importance for the risk engineers to ensure that temporary flood damage prevention procedures are stringently followed on site during inspections. Good safety procedures may be in place, however, these may be neglected on site. The consequences can be drastic. I mean, I think we all agree with that statement and sentiment, and therein lies the importance of a good risk engineering, or where a good risk engineering service from insurers can help support the project. But I think, in my experience, some of these things, by the time we get to site, it's too late. And that example there of having an elevated collar around the shaft is a really good example of that. By the time they've sunk the shaft and started to put the utilities and services down, that they've used up that space that could have been used for the collar. Whereas if the collar was there and the services were diverted up and over, then you can have that watertight barrier. Because, I mean, sadly, I've been to sites where you see they've built that collar and then they put a big penetration through it so they can get their power cables through. It's like, well, the water's going to love that penetration. So anyway, sorry, turn that into a question. Your reflections on that difference between what might be desired and planned, and that you actually find on site, and your ability to influence when you're on site.
Yeah, well, I think from my experience, both as a practicing engineer and as a risk consultant, is that a lot of the problems come when a change is made and no one thinks through the changes. And the underwriters, when they get the project in, they probably will send it to a risk consultant that's experienced in that field, and it will be looked at, and everything will be agreed and sort of happy. And then when it's on site, changes are made for which the underwriter may never be told about. The risk consultant will definitely not know if the underwriter doesn't know. And then you go and do a site visit and you look at the plan that they've got, and then you find that there's been quite significant changes done, but nobody's thought about what would happen, perhaps to a third party property or within the site. And it's things like that, because we all know things change on site. You'll find, certainly if you're working in London or any town centre, you're going to find a load of uncharted services, etc. So you'll then start having to get the people in and dig those up. They're not going to worry whether they're damaging your protection to your basement that you're building, and it can then be, your site can be vulnerable from what they're doing. So again, it's that's when you'll get the burst pipe with the water coming into the basement. So again, on one of the things we talked about a great deal when we were drafting this document was works that were going on, say perhaps either upstream or downstream, that had no effect to you. So upstream, they could be doing alterations that is going to mean that the water's going to come down to you more quickly, and then cause scour, etc., to your works that you've carried out. So yeah, it's so very important that any changes are actually put back to the underwriter, because say we can write as whatever we want in there, but as in our document, but if it's not followed, it can lead to disastrous circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, coming back to the original point, within the document, we do have a sort of a draft flood risk management plan check sheet. So for the risk engineers out there, it's something that we're going to, we're trying to create a route for risk engineers who are on site, because we need you to be out there as often as you can, looking at these things, looking at the changes, the ongoing changes on site. And then you've got a baseline from which we can start reporting on these elements. So that's, again, we've talked about the schedule of deliverables, which is sort of a client contractor requirements, but then later on in the document, in the appendices, we've got an area to say, again, it's the start of a check sheet. We like people's feedback. We'd like to improve this document. So yeah, these areas are in there, and therefore that change management is another phase that I'm looking through the document whether we've actually mentioned that specifically. I can't see, so there's a good change we can have ourselves. Again, I had a project where one of my my biowash was within a landslip zone. Now, obviously, it's more likely to have landslips during a high water event, and I might lose one of my means of water removal. And you have to consider how you're going to how you're going to manage those exposures. It's the what if scenarios, and again that comes down from active understanding of the site and risk engineers asking simple questions. Yeah, okay.
Patrick, I've just seen that there's a question come in from CG about structures is now under increased pressure to address these EGs. And I would say on that one, in the UK and probably within Europe, the flood risk assessment that is normally prepared is part of an environmental impact assessment. So things like that about habitats and that will have all been dealt with, because these documents can be absolutely huge, and the flood risk assessment for the permanent state will be within part of that document. Usually, one of the very first when planning approval is given, usually about the second or third question on the planning, it says we want a construction management plan. Now that doesn't necessarily always include a construction flood risk assessment, but it should do on any sort of infrastructure type project. So but I should imagine there's the areas where it's more undeveloped, they won't have such strict planning rules, so the ESG considerations may not be considered. James, do you want to?
Yeah, again, just to say on those elements again, I think what we've sort of identified it is a lack of process, for want of a better word, for the construction phase. That the completed project, we've gone through all the ESGs, you've gone through all the planning requirements. It's those elements within the construction phase that aren't being considered, and that's what this document is trying to create a process to follow. Again, I will go back to the schedule of deliverables. Within the document, it's on page 31 to 33. And I'm just gonna, you can't see it, I'm gonna off screen. So it goes through the planning and project development stage, then the tender stage, then the design phase, contractor appointment stage, and mitigation during the construction phase, and then some emergency planning during for that day. So what we're trying to do is separate the various elements out and offer recommendations onto the scope and the intent of each element of that, what the deliverable is, and who's the responsible party involved. So it's within the overall document. There's a 3-page section. So as I'm saying, as much as we would like to show this during this presentation, we want you to read the document. So I'll just reiterate that for the 47th time.
James, I'm just going to jump in there, and I'm very grateful for people asking questions. I'm going to take this question out of order. Don't worry, I'm going to come back to the other questions. I haven't forgotten them, but this is very timely, and I'm going to paraphrase the question slightly. But it's just making the point that sometimes projects get broken up into phases, and you might have an early works phase, and then you have the main works. The early works might include some excavations and flood diversion works or whatever, and then you have a second phase which is actually build the project. So the question is really around how do we deal with these sorts of situations to prevent there being a gap and to ensure that sort of consistency across the entirety of the project. And I think, not to answer the question for you, but I think that's what you're referring to there, James, in terms of the document very much is cradle to grave. But please, I'll leave you to answer the question.
Yes, it is cradle to grave, and we are looking at all phases. I did note in the chat about designs for temporary works. What return periods are you looking at? Well, it sort of depends on how long it's going to be there for. Because these are the dependency areas that you're looking at. Remembering that sort of return periods are statistical estimations of flood event frequencies, and so the longer it's there for, the longer it's exposed, and therefore the more likelihood you're going to have a greater event, a larger event. So you need to be designing for those larger events. And I think that's what we're trying to say. You've got to look at each one individually. There may be no flood risk, or there may be a massive flood risk. We don't know. We're just saying that what we're trying to do is create a process for you to be followed, so everybody within that pathway of deliverables understands what their role is.
And from having been involved in the tunnel code of practice, I see a couple of analogies here. One, the documents are intended to support the industry. And this is not about us coming in and telling the industry how to do things. This is about us supporting them to do things better. So back to that example there, what we'd like is that project to be adopting the principles of this document from cradle to grave, and therefore it doesn't matter whether the insurers chop and change. The project is following a robust process and managing its risk adequately, properly, and that's exactly the same as the tunnel code of practice. The other analogy here is about return periods, and interestingly, the tunnel code of practice recognises that the risk of collapse, particularly collapse in the temporary state, is so high that temporary work should be designed to the same return period as permanent works. So that's another way of answering that same question about what's the right return period.
And in some instances, the temporary works are more vulnerable, so you need to be maybe
correct
over designing the requirements than that you would do for the permanent works. So again, it absolutely depends upon the vulnerabilities within the project itself. Mm-hmm. Yes, you might well need to be more robust in your protection of your temporary works than your permanent works.
Please, Trevor, we've interrupted you long enough.
No, it's all right. I think yep. Well, if we move on to the next slide, then, which is section 7, which is one that James was far more involved in than I am. But basically, it's what it says on there is we've seen a lot of the high rise in London have quite substantial damage purely from rainstorms getting through the elevation, because usually, if it's a project where they're using a lot of pods, such as student union or hotels, and the pods are being made off site and being brought in, it's in those temporary sort of doors that they've left in the external elevation. So it's a matter of making sure that there's a proper plan of how it's going to be worked, how the building can be made perhaps temporary waterproof during periods when there's going to be high weather or larger vulnerabilities from the weather. Whereas, because it's always, or certainly on all the sort of ones I've seen, it's always one of these plastic doors that's been put up. They're like a warehouse door that are on temporary there, and they're just not adequately sort of closed up during the weekends. Rain comes and no one's there on site to deal with anything, so it can cause a very large amount of sort of damage and drop down the number of floors. So again, it's on a lot of the high-rise buildings, they're sort of putting in temporary waterproofing over a floor, which then creates a roof, so that they've got everything finished below that temporary waterproofing level, and there's no apertures left open or anything like that. So again, it's just looking at all those factors on there and coming up with a sensible plan.
Again, we've got to be thinking about vulnerabilities of certain materials. If you're using CLT, if you're using mass timber in there, again, if you've got large footprints, large for buildings, and there's a drainage down into smaller area basements, which are using, you know, for your plants and things, we are seeing floods in basements. I said that before. A lot of the high-rise contractors, certainly in the UK, they tend to have between 3 and 5 stories of waterproofing level between as they're trying to seal off, and won't, or try not to get any of the fit out works, the first stage fixing in place. You're trying to create that buffer so they can manage that water. Unfortunately, a lot of renovation projects, I would suggest it's more problematic.
Yeah.
And you know, where they're diverting rainwater pipes through buildings, and you know, there's some blokes left off a bucket to support a pipe or something, and somebody knocks it. You know, it's all the stuff that we see day in, day out. So it's just understanding and getting the clients to understand the exposures that they have. Because otherwise they're going to be cutting plaster work out. You know, they're taking the first bottom meter of the plaster work out on every floor, stripping out high value, you know, bathroom and kitchen units and things like that. It's what we see regularly. It has the same impact as sort of escape of water within the buildings, but it can be just as well controlled. So yeah.
Okay, back to you, James.
Okay, where are we next?
Section 8.
Section 8.
Next.
Yeah, please, just moving on. Again, the Section 8 it's just trying to put in place appropriate procedures. Again, using the responsible people to put flood warning, getting the 72-hour or earlier flood warning plans that you've pre-agreed, that are written, procedures in place, and being able to roll them out. There's some excellent sort of hurricane management ones in the US that can be used at, and other tropical cyclones out east. And it's just the appropriate responses, and it just requires the consideration and practice, understanding how they're going to do they're going to protect the site and the people, and having identified the vulnerabilities on the site. So it's actually what you're currently building, you know, understanding what's vulnerable and what you need to do to mitigate against causing significant damage, or restoration works, so you can get yourself back on track as quickly as you can. There's some excellent information systems out there. There's now casting systems. There's instacasting systems, which I only came across yesterday, that enable you to forewarn you of the potential for flooding, especially surface water flooding. You've obviously got country agencies. We have environmental agencies in the UK to tell us about that. I was in Miami earlier on this year, and I kept getting pinged because we had a heavy storm event. We had about 15 inches of rain in 2 days, which was unusual for sort of June, May time, and I was perpetually getting pinged to say, this is a matter of life and death, do not leave your hotel. So I had to stay behind. And these are systems that should be used. And then at the end of it, a plan for recovery and recommencement of the works. Within the appendices, we put a little check sheet in the back to suggest how to operate it. Yeah, it's stuff that the sites should be doing. But again, as risk engineers, we should be reviewing how they're going to do that. and if there's any opportunity to suggest improvements, then that's what part of the risk engineering process is. Yeah, so that's that's what Section 8 responds to. Okay, if anyone got any questions on Section 8, I'm hoping not.
Not specifically on Section 8, no.
Okay, fine. Yeah, yeah. So I think the only thing on that one would be the emergency procedures should be within the flood incident report plan, so you should create one of them. And then finally, moving on to the appendices, these are some excellent pieces of documentation that I would strongly recommend whoever does look at the document to have a read of it. It certainly helps with understanding of the document, and we used it as a repository for information that is going to expand your knowledge of the risks. Just looking back through, so the certainly appendix 1 is the flood risk management plan, which outlines the areas to be looked at, and incorporates the flood risk management check sheet. Again, this is for the risk engineers amongst us. Oh, pardon me. Flood risk 2 is the pre-event action list. Again, it's just an example. Appendix 3 says common types of flooding. It just explains different sorts of flooding and the various pathways from river streams and brooks, what you're going to find, canals, potentially issue with canals and culverts, pluvial flooding, flash flooding, a little bit of information on things like wadis, coastal storm surge events, tidal tsunamis, groundwater events, and a little bit on the utility mains, some of the issues there. It continues on with levees and reservoirs and dams, and also comments on combination events. As we've found that the flooding events tend to be a combination of multiple sources, driven by the weather, obviously. So you might have a heavy rainfall event, which causes surface runoff. If it extends for a considerable period of time, you've got saturated ground conditions, and then you can get these combined with storm surges and other things, and all these elements can sort of breach the levels that you are considering. On this sheet here, you've seen sort of the EA based freeboard levels. Again, this is sort of a UK related suggested readings. We aren't putting in our document suggested levels because you need to consider it each one for each document, for each project. Yeah, so going through that element, that there is a section on culvert screens, which are particularly vulnerable, and then we've got a section 5. Again, just goes through obviously the elements to be considered, and it sort of goes into greater detail on the probability and return periods, and giving examples of what those. Oh, sorry. So that's section 6. What they really mean. So yes, please have a look through them, because they will give you a greater insight. Flooding can be confusing in with return periods and probability exceedance and reoccurrence intervals and things like that. So it's being able to understand different languages, because I think it can be quite confusing to understand exactly the exposure that you have. And what we try to do is to I'm going to say simplify that, but to create a small area where you can sort of understand what your exposures are in there. So yeah, that's the document itself, with a little bit of a little bit of an appendices, at the back. Sort of coming to the end of the talk, and prior to finishing, I'd just like to send my thanks to the other co-authors of the report. In addition to Trevor, there we have Adi Amo from RSA, Mark Allen, DI, Spiros Constantis, and Professor Panos Spirides, both from Ruler, Kevin Province, so some of you may know from Risk Engineering Solutions, and Alan Patrick at Chubb. So thank you for all of them. You spent an awful lot of time putting this together, and I get the pleasure to talk about it in front of the people on this call. So thank you. Patrick, have we got any more questions?
I think you had one last slide of key takeaways, but just before we get that
did
up,
we? All right, let's move to that one then.
Just one. It is a question where it's a little bit beyond the scope of the document, of course, but it makes a very good point. It says flood is a high risk, but extreme temperatures and drought could also be a high risk. Now, of course, you know that your document is very specifically addressing flood. So, but I'm interested in your observations on that. I would make the point that this is exactly why we would look for a robust risk management framework within any project, because if you've got a decent framework for identifying and managing risk, then whatever the risks that get fed into that process can then be managed. But gentlemen, I wonder if you had any observations on the broader range of physical climate change risk.
Well, from the permanent works point of view, they should be looking at climate change, because in the flood risk assessment that's done from for the permanent case, they will have included climate change over whatever the design life of the project is. So one would think that within this much shorter period of the construction phase, then it would have all been accounted for from that point of view. But clearly, if you're using sort of the temporary works, etc., and it's going to be sheet piling, something, or to build cofferdams and things like that, then yes, they have got to be designed obviously for the climate change parameters during the work. So permanent works will incorporate movement joints, etc., and that then have got to be dealt with. It's construction joints, they've got to be made sure they're waterproof, etc., especially in basement construction and dam construction. So yeah, there's an awful lot to think about. And to say I think because you're always thinking of the design as a permanent works designer, you're thinking of it during the design life, which should hopefully capture that. But thankfully, certainly in the UK, I can't speak for what is done for climate change elsewhere. In Europe, I would expect it to be very similar, because the UK has adopted all the Euro codes. So things like climate change and that should be in there. So yeah, it's just another thing that must be thought about. And of course, the big problem always with drought is that the ground is normally so hard after a drought that when it does rain, your runoff is very often very much more rapid, and then that can cause problems in, say, in narrow channels, U-shaped or steep-sided valleys. But if it's over, say, a large plain, the risk is much lighter. These are all the topographical things that must be considered.
It looks like,
sorry,
to me it looks like it's frozen. I don't know if that's the same for others.
I think that one is. I'll go through in a minute. But also, I mean, on the construction phase, we're looking at wildfire, especially on sort of infrastructure projects, and there are some guidelines out there for exposure to wildfire. But like I said, what we've tried to do, what we were asked and tasked to do, was to look at the effects of flood. if we're finding that we're asked to investigate other areas, then that's certainly something that we'd be more than willing to help with. But looking at the cost and value of flood related losses, I suspect that's probably on the construction phase more of a driver for ourselves.
Yeah.
And then just really looking at the key takeaways that sort of sit in the back of that slide. I'll just read through them. So the key takeaways that we'd like you to consider are that the document promotes construction stage flood risks, and as opposed to the operational phase. That's if we are looking at the construction phase. It provides clear examples of vulnerable elements. It promotes early consideration of the construction stage flood risk and flood risk assessments, and we're looking at that from the concept stage onwards. Provides clear examples of sources of water. We walk through each stage of its process, and exposures in relation to flood. It covers multiple project features. It provides examples of flood mitigation, provides emergency response suggestions, and provides deliverables in respect of demonstrating flood mitigation, which is again useful from the underwriter's perspective and from that of the risk engineer. There is a link in red on the bottom, so if you haven't looked on the CIREG site, you will be able to download it from this link, or please have a look at the CIREG site because it's available there too. Yeah. Anybody else got any questions?
I think we're getting very close on time now, so I think we need to be mindful of people moving on to other calls. But there is one last question that maybe we've got a minute on. Are risk engineers ever examining the scheduling of works during surveys, e.g. vulnerable works in and out of winter, wet seasons, etc.? I see a lot of variance in client approaches to scheduling of works in exposed areas.
That's certainly something that's covered under the document, and the answer to that is yes, we would. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing, certainly in the UK, that our normal weather patterns aren't quite what they used to be. And certainly the flooding we had in 2019 that caused significant damage were summer-related events. And as much as we'd like to schedule, again, it's project specific. You need to look at those elements where you can use seasonal management to mitigate the risks, to lessen any risks and change your program. Please consider it, but it has to be on a project specific basis.
Indeed. Okay. I think we don't have any more questions, and quite a few people have started to drop away now onto, finally it's cleared. I can now see your key takeaways. Yes, I think people are starting to drop off onto other calls or lunch or dinner or breakfast. So I think we'll draw it to a close there, gentlemen, and just finally from us, on behalf of IMI, I'd like to thank you both for your presentation together, and on behalf of underwriters, I'd like to thank you and the rest of the CIREG team for putting this document together. It is critically important. It is a growing area of concern, and that is evident from our loss statistics. And we're hoping all of us can do our bit to promote the document and support the industry to develop more robust methods for mitigating this growing exposure. So thank you both, and please pass on our thanks to the rest of the authors within CIREG. Stephanie, any final comments on behalf of IMIR, or should we wrap it up?
Just that send out a LinkedIn message with the CIREG document if you like. I'll do that later today, and a recording of this